Hello, this is Kerwin Yarde of Father-Son Galaxy. John Williams is one of the most accomplished film composers of all time. Throughout his 50-plus career, 50 years, he has composed iconic scores for films like Jaws, Star Wars, Superman, Indiana Jones, E.T., Jurassic Park, Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, Harry Potter, and many more. He's won 5 Academy Awards, 3 Emmys, 26 Grammys, and 7 British Film Academy Awards. He is a recipient of the Kennedy Center Honor, the AFI Life Achievement Award, and many others. His storied career is told in his very first biography, John Williams, A Composer's Life, written by my guest. Tim Greiving is an arts journalist who specializes in film music. He has written stories for NPR, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He contributes to the visual history program for the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences and teaches film music history at the University of Southern California. Tim Greiving, welcome to Father-Son Galaxy.
Thank you so much. What an honor to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to hold it up right here. I do have it right here in front of me. And this is when I got it in the mail, I was very surprised how heavy it was. It's about 556 pages, not including the acknowledgments or the index. Thank you so much for this book. I can't wait to get into it. When I first heard John Williams' music, the first time I heard it was back in 1978. I was 10 at the time. And I went to see Superman in the theaters. And I didn't see that many movies up to that point, but this movie, it just blew me away. Like the title, the opening, and then the music, how they complement each other and the themes throughout the film. I just became a fan immediately. And soon after that, I bought the Superman soundtrack. What was the first time you heard John Williams' score?
For me, it was Jurassic Park. And I'm a little younger, obviously. I didn't actually see the movie. I was too young to see the movie in the theater, but I heard the score playing on a cassette tape in my cousin's minivan, and the music spoke to me. The cover of the cassette spoke to me, but I was just curious what this great music was. And my older cousin explained there's this guy named John Williams. He writes music for movies. He wrote the music for Star Wars, Indiana Jones. And I realized, okay, I already know that music. I just wasn't aware of what a film composer was. So that was my entry point, and I've never looked back.
Yeah. Now, John Williams did not want a book written about him. Why?
I think it's a combination of reasons. He's a very private person. He's a very guarded, private person. He doesn't really he promotes the work, but he doesn't promote himself, and he just doesn't really disclose a lot about himself in interviews. Little bits and pieces here and there, but he just never wanted that level of sort of, I would wager he might say invasion of his privacy, but he also didn't want to spend a lot of time working on a book. He'd rather just be writing music and looking forward instead of having to kind of pause for a long period of time to just keep looking back. So those are the big 2 reasons why he didn't want a book.
And why was it important for you to write this book?
Well, as I say, I mean, I'm 9 years old when I hear that Jurassic Park score, and I was just hooked from that point on. And he's my favorite artist of all time. He's really the reason I do what I do. I write about film music professionally, and it's because I fell in love with his music when I was a kid. Writing about the composers and about the film scores is what drives me. Writing the story about him was always going to be the pinnacle of what I was doing. I thought it was impossible, and it was sort of impossible. Just, it was the culmination of my lifetime of passion and interest.
The book is so comprehensive. You don't start off the book with the birth of John Williams. You go further back and you talk about his ancestry. Tell us about Thomas Michael Nagel.
Yeah, so I did wrestle with that, because sometimes you read a biography and they're like, and their great-great-great-grandfather was a cobbler in this village in Europe or something. You're like, just get to the good stuff. But I discovered Thomas Nagel in the process of researching the book. It was not a well-known piece of information. Everybody knows that John Williams' father, Johnny Williams, was a musician, a drummer, and kind of in the world of showbiz. And so we kind of thought that's where it started. But I discovered a a birth certificate essentially of his father, belonging to a man named Thomas Nagel. And the more I dug into who this guy was, he was also a musician. He also played the piano and was a drummer. And he ended up being kind of a proto film composer, arranging music for orchestra that accompanied silent movies, mostly in Canada. I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that this this man who was his biological grandfather, who none of us had ever heard of before, who, by the way, John Williams had never heard of this man before either. So I told him about this guy, Thomas Nagel, and it was a revelation to him. I felt like it was too cool of a story to not start there. But one of the cool things about John Williams' life is that it runs in parallel to the innovation of Hollywood filmmaking. He's born right around the time when sound movies are becoming a thing, and the fact that his grandfather was sort of there at the beginning, the very beginnings of film and putting music to film. I could sort of tell the history of this whole art form by telling the story of his family and his ancestry. So I was sort of doing double duty by telling the story about Thomas Nagel.
And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but the story goes that Thomas Nagel and his wife divorced, and she and her son, who was John Williams' father, actually moved, and she remarried a gentleman with the last name of Williams, which is why Johnny Francis takes on the last name of Williams. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, she was mostly a single mother, but she remarried for less than a year, a much older gentleman by the name of Williams. But that is why his name is John Williams, from this kind of strange second marriage.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you mentioned, John Francis Williams is John Williams' father. He was a drummer for the studio orchestra. His mother, Esther Towner, was a dancer. It just seemed natural. Like you said, his grandfather and his father are both into music, and John would follow in his father's footsteps and become a studio musician. Who were some of the composers that influenced John?
I think the earliest ones who influenced him were actually songwriter composers like Jerome Kern, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin. He talked a lot about how those are the songs, that was the music he was hearing as a kid, and that's the stuff he kind of has in the back of his head, these really catchy songs from the Great American Songbook. There's a friend of the family named Claude Thornhill, who is a composer and arranger, and John talks about him a lot too. Just the way he orchestrated for French horns, kind of the colors that he got out of the orchestra. It wasn't until John was a teenager that he started listening or paying much attention to classical music. And some of the earliest influences on him were like Prokofiev, Rachmaninoff, the Soviets, as he calls them, which if you listen to their music, you can hear this kind of romantic, melodic storytelling quality that feels like proto John Williams or proto film music, but he's influenced by a lot of different composers.
And then he decided that he didn't want to be a studio musician anymore, but he wanted to actually become a film composer. What was the first film he scored?
The first feature film is a movie called Daddy-O, which is a B movie, like a drive-in movie about a bunch of young people driving their cars and, calling each other Daddy-O, stuff like that, which is very much of the time. It's not a very noble movie. In fact, it was riffed on Mystery Science Theater 3000. That's the kind of level of cinema that it is. But we all got to start somewhere.
Right. He did quite a few films in the 50s and the 60s, but it was a Mark Rydell film, The Reivers, in 1969 that gave him recognition. Why is this score, The Reivers, considered a turning point in his film music career?
It's a good question. I think it's kind of where he was at in his career, and just sort of the collision of where he was at. He sort of ripened in his maturity and finding his voice and discovering what he wanted to be as a film composer. And he gets this kind of just the right canvas for that. We all kind of associate John Williams with these kind of, well, very melodic, obviously, like lots of themes for different characters and stuff, but a score that sort of tells the story of the movie on its own. If you just turned off the movie and listened to the score, you can sort of hear what's happening and hear who the characters are that are engaging. It's this storytelling narrator kind of approach. And The Reavers was this turn of the century storybook kind of movie that it just it it asked for that kind of score. And so John Williams was sort of exploring that. This was the right opportunity. I think he was inspired just to come up with some really beautiful and fun melodies. And it's not a great film, I have to say. I don't think it's a great movie. It's a good story, but he wrote a great score. And famously, Steven Spielberg, who is much younger, collected soundtracks, and he bought this soundtrack because Steve McQueen was on the cover. He'd never heard of John Williams before, but he fell in love with this score, just like a lot of us fell in love with the scores for his films. And so The Reavers is important for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, yeah. Their collaboration, Steven Spielberg and John Williams, is remarkable. So I'm going to spend some time talking about their collaboration. But can you talk about the first time Spielberg and Williams met?
They had a arranged lunch in Beverly Hills. Spielberg wanted to meet John Williams, the guy who wrote the music for The Reavers, who was like 15 plus years older than him. So a very strange thing, actually, when you think, if you put yourself in the moment, it's this young, very nerdy kind of kid who collects soundtracks and like memorizes soundtracks, asking to meet with this, at this point, a composer who's been around for a while, could be almost his dad's age. But Spielberg's getting his start as a director, and he's about to score or direct his first theatrical feature film. So he gets to hire a real composer, and so they have this arranged lunch. And it sounds like a funny experience because Spielberg's sort of showing off his film music knowledge and humming themes and stuff. John Williams, he's forgotten the themes that Spielberg is humming because he doesn't care as much about the film music as Spielberg does. And he's thinking, this kid is so young. He's still got like acne on his face and things. But they hit it off enough that I think John Williams said, I will look at your film when it's done and I'll think about it. I'll consider scoring it. And the movie was The Sugarland Express. And when John Williams saw the movie, he just thought, finally, here's a really great director. It was sort of the director he'd been waiting his whole career for up to that point, and they hit it off immediately, artistically.
Since 1974, John Williams has scored 29 films directed by Spielberg. And why do you think Spielberg insisted that it needed to be John to score his films? Like, John, something about John's music touched him, and he wanted to make sure that whenever he directed a film, that primarily he wanted John to score it. Why is that?
This is one of the things I asked Spielberg when I interviewed him, because I thought, what was it about you that made you want this kind of music and this particular composer? Because it wasn't really what was cool at the time. Like the mid 70s, it wasn't cool to have old-fashioned kind of throwback Hollywood orchestra scoring, big emotions and that storytelling quality. It was not in vogue. So Spielberg talks about the classical music that his parents took him to. He remembers being terrified at different classical like symphony performances, but really overwhelmed by the emotions of that. And how he just, when he's making movies, he wants to recreate that feeling for his audience. He wants them to be scared or swooning or just feeling big feelings. And he associates that with the great old classical music. Plus, he grows up watching movies of the 40s and 50s and 30s, and he loves those scores. He loves those old classic, original studio days Hollywood composers. And he found someone who sort of apprenticed with those same composers and knew exactly what he was looking for and has the chops and the gift to provide what he wanted. Once they really sealed the deal on Jaws, and Jaws was such a phenomenon, and that score was like such a huge part of why that movie worked so well, Spielberg never wanted to let him out of his sights. And he realized how versatile John Williams was. He can do anything. He can do Jaws. He can do Schindler's List. He can do and everything in between.
Yeah, Spielberg once said, from my point of view, I have absolute trust and faith that John is right. When he sees my movie for the first time, which I have already seen dozens of times, John's first impression of my films are the impressions I listen to. then I get to hear how much John loves the movie because musically he enhances it and takes it to an entirely different level. And that's what I think music does for movies. So part of that seems like, the trust level um, that was very important between Spielberg and Williams. I go back to the example of Jaws you just mentioned, where, this is just the second movie that the two of them are collaborating on. And Spielberg had an idea of what the music for Jaws was supposed to sound like. But then when he came in and heard John play those two notes, he thought it was a joke. But then John convinced him that this is the movie you made. This is how it's supposed to sound. And he realized that John was right. And I think maybe that might have been part of why the relationship continued on for 50 more years, that he realized that, okay, well, John probably knows his film better than him because, he's seen his movies, Spielberg's seen his movies over and over. So he has his ways are set on how his movie looks like and how the music should look like. But then we have someone like John who's coming in and seeing it for the first time. He's playing something completely different. And Spielberg is just going with whatever John comes up with.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it was in that moment where Spielberg had these preconceived ideas. John Williams sort of throws them out and gives him something else that initially seems kind of wrong. And then he realizes how right John Williams' intuition is. And it's kind of from there on, he just said, I trust you. I trust you to do. Obviously, Spielberg sometimes will ask for something specific, or will say, I had an idea, or he'll put something in the temp score that he thinks might work. So it is a collaboration, but I think there's a lot of him just saying, do your thing, because I know it's going to be better than anything I could imagine.
You mentioned in the book that you have a favorite score, and it was AI, artificial intelligence. Tell me why. Why do you like this score?
Part of it is when I saw the movie, I was 16, and I was in a kind of existentially, seeking, seeker kind of moment, and the movie deals with a lot of big, heavy existential questions. So I think that probably flavors the power of that score for me. But I also just think it's a masterpiece. I think one of the main reasons a lot of people love John Williams is these character themes, these like instantly unforgettable character themes, and there's a lot of that in AI. It has that kind of storybook character theme based quality, but it's more mature and more dark and more nuanced than kind of a Star Wars kind of score. It goes to some really heavy places, heartbreaking places. It's creepy and ultimately just like so heartbreakingly, bittersweetly beautiful. It's like the whole human experience in one score. I just love it so much.
You know, um, One of the things you were discussing in your book is John's longevity. It seems like he's outlasted many of his contemporaries when it comes to film scoring. And there was a section in the book that I read it and I couldn't forget about it. You remind us that in 2004, we lost three great film composers, Jerry Goldsmith, David Raksin, and Elmer Bernstein. Towards the end of their film career, you said all three struggled to adapt and evolve with changes to the film industry. So Raksin retired and went to USC to become a teacher. Goldsmith wrote music for a Richard Donner film called Timeline, but the score was rejected. And then with Martin Scorsese, Bernstein was supposed to score Gangs of New York, but that was replaced by another composer. Now, what I find interesting about this is Goldsmith and Bernstein are working with directors that they worked with in the past. Jerry Goldsmith scored The Omen, which won an Oscar, and Elmer Bernstein scored The Age of Innocence for Scorsese, which I thought was a beautiful score. So I'm just sad to hear we don't know the story as to why these scores were scrapped, but it's sad to hear that towards the end of their career that it didn't seem to me that they were given the respect that you would give to a composer so well known and renowned as the two of these composers. Can you speak more about this, about talking about their struggling to adapt and evolve in with changes to the film industry?
Yeah. I just think part of this is just the cruel nature of Hollywood. And when you reach a certain age and you've been around for a long enough time, you start to look like, an old horse that needs to be put out to pasture, or like an athlete who's sort of past their prime, and we need to like bench them basically. That kind of is what this feels like. Is composers, and this is probably true of other parts of filmmaking. It's definitely true of acting in some cases, but composers start to seem a little bit stuck in the past, a little old fashioned. A lot of times it's not even the directors that are thinking that. It's the studio or the producers thinking, this guy's kind of getting up there and his music sounds like, 20, 30 years old film music. Let's get something fresher or more edgy or hip or whatever. This happened with Alfred Hitchcock and Bernard Herrmann. It's happened to most film composers. You sort of have this shelf life. So some of that is just outside pressure and just the way you're perceived as being, you're past your expiration date, move along. I do think sometimes composers do kind of get stuck in their ways, and they don't learn how to keep up with the times. Now it's interesting because John Williams doesn't necessarily keep up with the times in terms of technology. He still doesn't know how to run a computer. Um, and it's not like he's writing hip, edgy techno music or something. He was very fortunate in that he had someone like Steven Spielberg who's still continuing to make very, culturally important movies and is never going to abandon John Williams. But I do think John Williams has this quality of always wanting to do better, always wanting to learn, always wanting to try harder. He never is just coasting on his past successes. And I wouldn't say that necessarily Goldsmith and Bernstein were doing that, but I think there's a general trend of artists, any artist, sort of reaching a certain point in their career and then sort of just coasting or backsliding and not trying to propel themselves and push themselves forward. And I think John Williams, one of his many great qualities is he's so always curious, always wanting to learn more, grow, soldier on and outdo himself if he can. And I think that's a part of the recipe of his success, or at least his longevity.
George Lucas considered using classical music for Star Wars, similar to what Stanley Kubrick did for 2001: A Space Odyssey. And he was having a conversation with Steven Spielberg, and Spielberg convinced Lucas to use original music, and he recommended John Williams. Describe the soundtrack, Star Wars, and its influence on pop culture. And how did Star Wars change John Williams' life?
It's massive. I devote a whole chapter to 1977 because it's the year of Star Wars and Close Encounters. But that is sort of Jaws is, I describe Jaws as the big bang of his career, but 1977 and Star Wars specifically is sort of like, I don't know what's bigger than the Big Bang, but it's so important. And it does have that background of almost being a classical collage, a collage of existing classical pieces like 2001. But brilliantly, what John Williams did was take the essence, the flavors of old classical pieces, whether it's The Rite of Spring or The Planets by Gustav Holst. People point these influences out as if they caught John in the act of cheating and copying someone else's homework. But that was the whole design of that first Star Wars score was, let's throw in these flavors of these classical pieces that are familiar to the audience's ears and has this feeling of a bygone time, which is what the whole point of that Star Wars was, to feel like it was a long, long time ago. But it's all John Williams music. It's all original themes for the characters. It's a synthesis of these different influences. So it's kind of this masterpiece of referencing something in the past while doing something completely original that feels like it's been around forever. And it's just also super catchy and beautiful and rousing and exciting. And it tells the story of the movie. That's why so many people bought that soundtrack, because you couldn't go rewatch the movie a million times in 1977. So what could you do? You'd put on the soundtrack and you'd relive the scenes and the moments by listening to that music, because the music captured those feelings and what was the action on screen so perfectly. And it was just this huge moment for this resurgence of the old-fashioned symphony orchestra score. It felt like old Hollywood. People started comparing John to Korngold and people like that. And it was just, I mean, the movie itself was a phenomenon, but the soundtrack was part of that phenomenon in such a huge way. It was such a big seller, that album. I talked to Mark Hamill and people like that saying John Williams is really responsible for so much of the success of Star Wars and why that movie worked and why people fell in love with it. John Williams becomes inextricably part of the Star Wars formula, for lack of a better word. He is part of the DNA of what Star Wars is from that point on, and it just made him a celebrity and a household name like no film composer ever before that. So his career just kind of shoots into the into outer space, into the stratosphere with Star Wars. It's a hugely important score for so many different reasons.
Yeah. Now, it's another good example about trust, because at that point, John scored two films for Spielberg. It was Sugarland Express and Jaws. But then when George came to him and talked about, looking for a composer or using classical music, and Spielberg recommending John, the story goes is that Spielberg goes over to John Williams and says, well, this friend of mine, George Lucas, is doing a movie called Star Wars. Would you be interested in composing the music? And John never heard of George Lucas, had no idea what Star Wars meant. I think he was actually considering scoring another film called A Bridge Too Far. It was a war movie with an all-star cast. And then Spielberg said, don't do that film. Don't do it. It's too commercial. Do Star Wars. Do Star Wars. And John said yes. I mean, if these two gentlemen, Spielberg and Williams, didn't have that relationship from the very beginning, we would not have had Star Wars music for the next 9 films. I mean, the main theme, the Princess Leia theme, the Imperial March, Yoda's theme, all of that would never existed if Spielberg didn't just simply ask John Williams, and John Williams said yes.
It is a real testament to the trust there. And it makes sense that John Williams would prefer to do a prestigious grown-up movie instead of this unknown filmmaker's kids movie, which essentially is what they were all thinking about it as.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the first Star Wars without any music, you could see how that wouldn't necessarily be so tempting to someone in his place. But Spielberg, I think, recognized this is the perfect canvas, the perfect opportunity for the kind of things that John Williams is so good at, that so few people are as good at that he is. And fortunately, John agreed, and we're all the better for it.
Absolutely. And I like the quote that you had in your book. You said, Star Trek inspired a generation of kids to become scientists and astronauts. Star Wars inspired a generation of kids to become musicians. I think that's absolutely true. Yeah.
And filmmakers, but yes, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Tanglewood. Tell me about Tanglewood, and why is this place so important to John Williams?
So for people who don't know, Tanglewood is this campus, this kind of classical music campus in Western Massachusetts. It's the summer home of the Boston Symphony, but it's also where just classical, very talented classical students and teachers and conductors from all over kind of congregate every summer, and they do lessons, conducting lessons. You walk around this campus and you're hearing performances everywhere, little chamber groups or big orchestra. They have this big outdoor amphitheater called the Shed. But Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland and all these kind of luminaries have passed through there and been a big part of that. And when John Williams becomes the music director of the Boston Pops in 1980, he's sort of now part of this whole world of, we all go to Tanglewood in the summer and we just play classical music all summer long. And some of it's old classical music, some of it's modern, avant-garde classical music. But it's like this, he calls it the Vatican of like high art classical music in America. And over time, he's not just conducting Pops concerts there, he's writing a cello concerto for Yo-Yo Ma, who premieres it at Tanglewood. And he loves this place because of the activity of classical music and the fact that he gets to hang out with people like Yo-Yo Ma and Leonard Bernstein and just like the who's who in the classical world. He also loves it because it's like pastoral, beautiful, forested, amazing views. I've been there several times myself now, and just an amazing, like, serene place to be. But I call the second half of my book Tanglewood, part 1 Hollywood, part 2 Tanglewood, partly because, yes, it's an important part of the second half of his story, but also it's a symbol of classical music, um, not elitism, but sort of the high pinnacle of classical music in America. And I make the argument that John Williams first sort of conquered Hollywood, became sort of the top film composer in Hollywood. And then in the second half of his career, he becomes part of Tanglewood. He becomes one of the great just classical composers of our time, and fully accepted by these great conductors and by these great musicians. So it's sort of a metaphor for what he did in the last 40 something years of his life. But I also liked the Hollywood Tanglewood tree imagery. That was kind of cute too. But there you go.
Yeah, well, I think Andre Previn was the one who would push him to go back to doing concertos, because Previn didn't like the idea of him being a Hollywood film composer. So I think he was just maybe having the best of both worlds. Like in between breaks of scoring films, he would go to Tanglewood and, create a concerto, which is,
That's true.
yeah,
That's true.
yeah,
And
exactly. Yeah.
Previn was the kind of slightly older friend, mentor, voice in his head, kind of pushing him out into the classical world. Previn wanted him to leave Hollywood altogether, and John, I think, wisely thought, no, this is where I belong. Hollywood is where my music is going to be heard by billions of people around the world, and it's where I can write music that people just gobble up and love. But he did have these grander ambitions to write, avant-garde classical music and different things. But the other thing about Tanglewood is it's not just that John Williams kind of went there and wrote this kind of artsy-fartsy concerto music. He elevated what film music was inside the classical world. Originally, the classical world really rejected film music as kind of a stinky, it wasn't real music. It wasn't serious music. It wasn't art music. And John Williams, through his post as the Boston Pops director, basically makes the argument that no, it belongs here in some form. You have to kind of pick where you put it, and you have to make the right selections. But the best film music belongs here too. It belongs in the concert hall. It belongs at Tanglewood. So that was also part of the victory. It wasn't just him kind of going and writing this other kind of music. It was him saying, my film music and the best film music by others is something we should all be performing at the highest level in these kind of, celebrated places. And he did that very successfully.
You attended his piano concerto this past summer. How did it go?
Yes, July. It was great. Yeah, I mean, it like a lot of his concertos, it's kind of like, whoa, that doesn't sound like John Williams I know. It's very challenging to the ear in some places. Then there are these kind of beautiful passages and really fun passages, and you just have to go along for the ride. I loved it. I loved, it's 2025. John Williams has been around for 93 years. He's been writing music for 70 plus years. And I was just marveling at the fact that we are still here on the planet with him. He's here. I'm watching him give feedback to the piano player and the conductor and the orchestra about this new piece that he just wrote. It's unbelievable that he's still doing it, and we still get to kind of share the planet with him. So I was very giddy.
So between the time the book went to press to the release of the book, John lost 3 more of his contemporaries, Ennio Morricone, Quincy Jones, and Lalo Schifrin. But John is still here, like you said, and he seems to be the last man standing. Do you think he's here for a reason? And do you think that his interest, that he may still have an interest and strength to actually score at least one more film?
I don't know why he's still here, other than, genetically he's very lucky. He didn't have any kind of sort of debilitating diseases or cognitive decline that is so common for people at a certain age. He's stayed healthy and active. And I think honestly, continuing to write music is using his brain, and conducting is using his body, and sort of through his own work, he just kept himself very healthy, and he's been very, very lucky in that way. He is still writing music, and I can't say for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if he might still score another film. We'll have to wait and see, but I don't think it's impossible.
Well, Tim, once again, I truly love this book. I've been spending, most of my life trying to collect his soundtracks, and I have pretty much most of them back as far as Valley of the Dolls. And then whenever I would get to that part of the story where you're talking about a particular movie, I would play tracks to that film as I'm reading your book. So I was nerding out on your book is what I'm trying to say. This is, yeah.
Well, I appreciate it, but you got to read it that way. Honestly, I mean, I love reading books about composers and musicians, and just, I got to listen to what they're talking about. It just enhances the whole experience. So you did the right thing, but I really appreciate your enthusiasm about it.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I know you're very busy, and I'm honored to have you on the podcast. And once again, I'm a big fan of yours, and I can't wait to see what you have coming up next. If there's any other projects you're planning on working on, can you tell us if there's anything else you have going on?
I continue to write things for the LA Times and cover film music, mostly, what's happening now. I will continue to, I also have a Substack, if people want to check that out. It's called Behind the Moon, and it's basically where I've been documenting the stories behind the book, and my time interviewing John Williams, and things I couldn't fit in the book. And so if you want to go even nerdier, if you want to explore the deeper wells of all this, I'm writing posts on a weekly basis there that are all about John Williams. So I imagine I'll be writing about John Williams till I die. I'm not going to get tired of him. But yeah, hopefully I've got another book in the works sooner or later. But for now, I'm just kind of enjoying the ride of talking about this one, which I've been sort of building up to writing my whole life.
Excellent. Excellent. And is there anywhere else where people can find you?
You can go to my website, timgreiving.com, and I kind of post, things about events that I'm doing. Maybe I'll be doing an event in your town. I've got several coming up in the next few months, and just social media. I'm on Instagram and Facebook, but yeah, check out my Substack if you want to see more of my writing.
Yeah. Well, if you're coming to our town, I hope I can get there and I can have you sign my book. So that'll be an honor.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. Tim Greiving, the author of John Williams, A Composer's Life. This is Father Son Galaxy. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts. We're on audio platforms. We're also on YouTube, Instagram, X, and TikTok. So thank you so much once again, Tim Greiving, for being on our podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening or watching. Until next time, take care, and we will see you again.